So great. Without much further ado, let us get started. I would like to now invite our host, Dr. Gareth Johnston, Director General of WorldFish, to officially welcome all of us and deliver a few opening remarks. Over to you, Gareth.
Welcome. Fantastic. So a warm welcome to everybody, and thanks for everybody who's joined. I think, as Tana just mentioned, there's a lot of people who are registered to this event, and there's obviously a lot of interest. I'd like to also give a special thanks to our esteemed panelists who will contribute their expertise to our discussion. It is also great to see so many audience participants representing, well, we know research, government, non-for-profit, private sector, all around the globe. This international, interdisciplinary network is crucial to harness the potential of aquatic foods to drive effective COVID-19 recovery and sustainable food systems transformation. And we meet at a really critical time in the midst of a pandemic. This has largely shifted its epicenter from the developed to the developing countries. We must realize that the reality of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals in under 10 years has been seriously challenged by this pandemic. The economic crisis triggered by COVID-19 looks set to increase the number of undernourished people by at least 14 million to over 80 million people. And another 70 million will be driven into extreme poverty. These are staggering numbers. Under these circumstances, all of us must reimagine new ways of doing things and working together. This pandemic has forced us to confront the urgent need to transform our food system, to do better for people and for our planet. With a renewed focus on food systems research approaches that are interdisciplinary and holistic, we have an opportunity to rethink the future of food, where it comes from, how it is produced, distributed and consumed, who benefits from it, how it impacts our environment, how prepared it leaves us for dealing with major climate events or the current global disruptions like the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, we must link land and aquatic food production systems, examine the opportunities, options and trade-offs if we are to enable a true food system transformation towards healthy and sustainable diets that works for both the people and our planet. So aquatic foods must be part of the solution. Investing in aquatic foods research agenda is investing in inclusive food, nutrition, economic and environmental health. It is investing in COVID-19 response, recovery and resilience. So demand for fish and aquatic foods has never been higher and continues to grow, especially in the developing world. Fish consumption is growing at a yearly growth rate of just over 3%, outpacing both the world population expansion rate and the rise in meat consumption. Annual fish per capita consumption globally has reached a record of 20.5 kilograms per person. So fisheries and aquaculture are central to the nutrition and livelihoods of more than 800 million people in developing countries, particularly those vulnerable to climate change, poverty, conflict and humanitarian emergencies. So with investment in better management and technology innovation, the ocean, if we think of it as a big, giant aquatic food system, can provide over 6 times more food than it does today. Aquatic foods can offer a critical solution for the 2 billion people worldwide who suffer the triple burden of malnutrition. We cannot afford to ignore these facts if we are to feed and nourish 9 billion people by 2050. So despite their importance, fish and aquatic foods are frequently overlooked in important policy and investment decisions. Now, there has been a historical underinvestment in these areas of research because traditionally the aquaculture research agenda has been largely focused on land-based food production systems. The critical gaps in knowledge, as well as quite a few misconceptions, serve to underestimate the role and contribution of aquatic foods to the global sustainable development agenda, particularly in the light of the current COVID-19 pandemic. We do see some shifts in attitudes, spearheaded by the CGIAR, the world's largest global agriculture research and innovation network, that are responding collectively to transform food systems to end hunger by 2030. This is what makes discussions like today's so important. Together, we need to mobilize a global movement to embolden these shifts to a more sustainable food system, where the research community, policymakers, donors, investors, business leaders, local producers, processors and traders, and consumers could create shared value and co-design interventions that make aquatic foods an integral part of the food system's transformation agenda. So if aquatic foods are to be part of a sustainable and inclusive future of shared prosperity for all and a healthy planet, there are three things I would like us to accomplish. First, we need to ensure the sustainable production of diverse aquatic foods so that we can minimize the impact on the environment and increase our resilience and adaptation to climate risk. Secondly, we need to ensure aquatic foods are affordable and accessible so that we can maximize social and economic impacts for shared prosperity and inclusive growth. And thirdly, we need to ensure aquatic foods are safe to eat, and part of the solution to key nutrition and public health challenges. So with these in mind, I'd like to lead into this discussion to hear from the panelists and yourselves, the audience themselves, on how together we can mobilize a global research agenda to boost aquatic foods' contribution to food and nutrition security and the wider sustainable development goals. I really look forward to the discussion, to the panelists' presentations and responses. And over to you, Tana. Thank you very much for allowing me to make the introductions tonight.
Thanks, Gareth, and thanks for sort of setting the scene and the tone, I guess, of this discussion today. I hear from IT that we can actually now go to that audience poll, and since we have close to like 400 people online and that number sort of continues to grow, it'd be great to sort of find out, you know, where everybody's coming from. So let's try sort of the first question. So which region are you based? Where are you joining us from? I'm based in Malaysia, in Penang. So please do select one of the following options. We'll give you a few seconds to tell us. I know that our panelists are actually like across many of the regions as well, and also our team, you know, researchers and partners basically covers all the globe. Okay, so maybe we should sort of look at those results. All right, so a lot of people from Asia and the Pacific, despite the fact that it's 11 o'clock at night here. So a lot of interest, I guess, in this particular subject, and then followed by Europe and some people in Africa and Central Latin America and North America. Oh, great, so let's go on to the next question. Which type of organization or institution do you represent? Do you work for, you know, in the public sector, in the private sector? Are you involved in sort of academia? Do you do research or other sort of work that we haven't included in those choices? So do let us know. We'd love to sort of see a real sort of diverse group here of people and experiences and institutions. Okay, so we've got around 407 participants already, and that number keeps going up. Let's look at those poll results. All right, so lots of researchers in this group, very good. And a lot of people from the nonprofit sector, some private sector, welcome. People working in the policy I'm very interested to know about what's included in the other, but perhaps we'll do that another time. Okay, so then I have one more question before I introduce the first panel. So what specific research or policy topic are you most interested in relation to aquatic foods? So please do select one of the following options. So the first one around nutrition, diets, and public health. Option B, relating to climate change and the environment. C, inclusive growth and gender equality. Maybe just the COVID-19 response to the food disruption that we're all perhaps feeling in different degrees, but also the socioeconomic crisis. And maybe just generally the subject of food systems transformation, this thing that we're all hearing a lot these days. So a few more seconds for people to sort of tell us their particular interest in the subject, and let's see the results. All right, so yes, so food systems transformation, this is like the buzzword, I guess, or the buzz three words that we're all hearing, followed very closely by nutrition, diets, and public health, COVID-19 response, climate, as well as the inclusive growth and gender equality. Okay, great. The good news is that the panel of experts that we've assembled today has a really wide variety of experience covering most of those topics. So we're hoping that you'll find these things that we'll be talking to them with today. So indeed, let me first introduce all of you to our first group of panelists. So I'll ask our panelists to sort of turn their cameras on and their audio. The first panel will help explore the critical scientific research priorities that we need to keep in mind to ensure fish and aquatic foods are part of an effective research program, but also the COVID-19 recovery process. And what we also want to do is sort of explore this larger connection to the discourse on sustainable transformation of food systems. So first up, we have Gina Leape, who's the co-director at the Center of Ocean Solutions at Stanford University. Welcome, Jim.
Great. Thank you, Tana. Thank you for organizing this, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Gareth, for that introduction. I want to start by picking up on several themes that Gareth highlighted in his opening remarks and introduce you to the Blue Food Assessment. I think we all recognize that over the last several years, there has been one study after another that has looked at the challenge of how we nourish a population of 10 billion people on Earth while sustaining the Earth's natural systems. And one study after another concludes that the world will have to increasingly rely on food produced in ocean and freshwater fisheries and aquaculture. And that's clear for a bunch of reasons. I mean, one is that with a growing and increasingly prosperous population, we see a rapid growth in the demand for animal protein. And we know that there would be dire consequences of trying to meet that demand for animal protein by expanding production of livestock, in particular beef. Because livestock already accounts for about 80% of the land devoted to agriculture, and it's a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. But increasing production of aquatic foods is appealing because it could help to meet that challenge. It has the potential to have a lower environmental impact. Aquatic foods can also be healthier. But the details really matter. And that's why we've launched the Blue Food Assessment. It's the first comprehensive look at aquatic foods, marine and freshwater, wild capture and farmed, to try and understand the details that matter. Just to illustrate that, I want to focus on two dimensions that will be important to this work. One is the diversity of aquatic foods. This is a hugely diverse sector. There are more than 2,000 species of fish, both wild capture and farmed, that are used to produce, that are produced to be eaten. And the nutritional value of these fish vary hugely across species. In fact, the work of Shakuntala Tulstad at WorldFish and other colleagues there has been crucial in helping us understand the importance of that diversity. So small pelagic fish like anchovies or sardines, for example, are many times richer in nutrients than, say, tilapia or catfish. And some indigenous species can be orders of magnitude greater for some nutrients. So the diversity of species matters a lot in terms of the health consequences and benefits of and possibilities of blue foods. But similarly, the way foods are produced has huge consequences for their environmental impacts. Mm-hmm. And different species are typically produced in quite different ways. And so bottom trawlers, as we know, can destroy benthic habitats. Longliners can kill thousands of birds and turtles, but other fishing technologies are much more benign, right? And have a much lower sort of environmental footprint. Similarly, on the farming side, you know, aquaculture developments that destroy coastal mangroves and make intensive use of pesticides and antibiotics can have a very heavy environmental footprint, while other farming technologies can similarly be much lighter. So the diversity in species, the diversity in production methods really makes a difference in terms of understanding the potential for a sustainable and nutritious path, as it were, for blue foods. The second dimension that we want to really dig into across the work of this assessment is to understand some of the interconnections that shape the trade-offs we're making and the choices that we have. And there are many of those, but let me just give you 3 examples. So one is obvious, is runoff of nutrients from increasingly intensive agriculture is causing enormous dead zones at the mouths of many rivers, wiping out fish nurseries and farms. So what we do in the agriculture side has direct consequences for aquatic food production. Similarly, there are some crops now increasingly grown to feed fish in aquaculture production, and there are some fish who are harvested to feed poultry. And then even within the aquaculture food sector, you see over and over again subsistence fisheries vitally important to the nutrition of local communities, that are undermined by trawlers from distant water fleets. And one of our lead authors in the Blue Food Assessment, Christina Hicks, and some of her colleagues, found that in a number of countries which suffer from undernutrition, nutrients available already in the marine fish catches within 100 kilometers of their coast, within their marine fish catches, exceed the dietary requirements for population within 100 kilometers of the coast. So the local people could actually be well fed on the resources that are right there. Mm-hmm. So finally, what all this means is that we simply can't afford to neglect the role that blue foods are playing and can play in the global food system. They already play a vital role in many parts of the world, and we know that will only increase. But it's also clear that we can't make good decisions about the future of food without including those dimensions, the roles that aquatic foods are playing and the trade-offs which aquatic foods embody. And similarly, coming from the fisheries side, I mean, being an ocean-focused person myself, I think we need to recognize that we can no longer simply focus on fisheries management or sustainable aquaculture in isolation, that we have to recognize that the decisions we're making in those sectors are embedded in the much larger food system and interconnected in myriad ways that really shape the impacts of our choices and the trade-offs that we are making. So there is an urgent need to bring a deeper understanding of blue foods and these interconnections into the broader discussion of the future of food. And this is the mission of the Blue Food Assessment. It is led by Stanford and the Stockholm Resilience Center in partnership with WorldFish and with Springer Nature, the publishers of Nature. We've assembled a team of leading scientists from all over the world. You can find them at bluefood.earth, our website. There are 2 central goals, as you might infer from what I've said so far. One is to identify, review, and fill important gaps in our understanding of the role of aquatic foods in global food systems now and into the future. But the second is, by doing that, to inform and propel change in policies and practices that will shape decisions about the future of food. And with that in mind, I mean, we have our eye particularly on the UN Food Systems Summit that is set for late next year. That summit is important for the moment it will create, a moment in which world leaders come together virtually or in person, focused on the future of food, and for the first time in a position to consider the whole picture. And the summit is actually at least equally important for the journey, for the work that begins now. The Summit Secretariat has set in motion 5 action tracks, each of which is looking to bring together researchers and actors around important challenges in the food system and to begin to develop solutions and initiatives to crack those challenges. And our commitment and our collaboration with the Food System Secretariat is to make sure that Blue Food is woven through each of those action tracks so that we're looking at the whole system in the way that we need to be. And I think that's the challenge that all of us need to line up around in the year ahead. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks so much for sharing these sort of insights and sort of really kind of focusing our mind to the whole picture that you sort of mentioned in terms of really informing and shaping decisions with impact on the future of food. But now let me turn to Gina Kennedy, who's the Director of Food Systems with USAID Advancing Nutrition, to sort of really explore what that future means in terms of nutrition. So Gina, given that the COVID-19 pandemic is this health and human crisis that's threatening the food security and nutrition of millions of people around the world, I mean, many were already suffering from hunger and malnutrition before the virus hit. People's ability to access safe, nutritious, and diverse diets is at risk, which in turn places also their health and resilience under threat. So how can research on fish and aquatic foods help advance the goals of the global nutrition agenda, particularly in this new reality that we're living in?
Yeah, thanks, Tana, and thank you very much to the organizers for letting me join this global conversation on how we transform our food systems using aquatic foods to safely and healthily nourish the planet and people. So globally, we've committed to a goal called Zero Hunger, or SDG 2. Zero hunger is the goal to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. This goal is the main goal that we consider for nutrition and health, but at the same time, we recognize research and development on aquatic foods helps to meet other goals such as poverty, gender, and life below water. Now, as you said, Tana, the global COVID pandemic is challenging us to become more creative and also resourceful in order to achieve these global targets. And that's why this event is so timely and so needed. So from the nutrition and food systems perspective, food systems for healthier diets, let me highlight the need for us to creatively orient our research to both fish and other aquatic foods. Often in nutrition, we consider fish, but we forget other nutrient-dense aquatic foods, including plants, crustaceans, insects that contribute to diets and livelihoods and can be especially important for food and nutrition security. So food systems research on aquatic foods for nutrition is important for several reasons. First, as has already been stated, fish and aquatic foods are rich sources of many essential nutrients, including protein, essential fatty acids, vitamins and minerals like iron, zinc, vitamin A, and calcium that all of us need for healthy growth and development and healthy long life. So the research documenting the actual nutrient composition of fish and aquatic foods needs to be expanded. Most of the nutrition data we have is coming from high-income countries, and this is leaving a really big gap in our nutrition data and knowledge from the global south. So the nutrient composition on these thousands of species of fish and aquatic foods that we use needs to inform and contextualize our national and global policies and investment actions. Secondly, as was already said, so it's great that we're reinforcing each other, there's this great diversity of fish and aquatic species, and that supports our dietary diversity. So diet diversity is a fundamental principle for good nutrition because it helps us ensure adequate intake of essential nutrients, but also other components of food like phytochemicals and fiber and properties in foods that help us maintain our health. So we need better research methods to actually capture the diversity of aquatic foods that people are consuming in their diets. And we also need to increase our research on the impact of the nutritional value of consuming fish and aquatic foods for cognitive development and lifelong good health. Third, fish and aquatic foods can help smooth seasonal food and nutrition insecurity to ensure year-round availability and affordability of nutrient-dense foods, two things that are really critical to ensure that we have a sustainable food system. We know that certain periods of the year, especially in rural areas, food availability and dietary diversity lowers. So we need to focus on production and cultivation of a wide range of aquatic foods that can help smooth these seasonal food shortages. This will help populations maintain adequate nutrient intake year-round, but it can also help the affordability of fish and aquatic foods, especially in these high fish consuming populations that also experience these seasonal food shortages. And finally, a neglected research area is food safety. So consumers are increasingly concerned with the safety of their food, as well as the sustainability of the food systems that produce their foods. So these food safety concerns need to be addressed within our food systems research. For example, by focusing on low-cost technologies to improve food safety, such as solar dryers and solar technology for cooling. These low-cost technologies have been demonstrated effective in the Solomon Islands and Malawi and other projects of WorldFish. So if we invest in these low-cost technologies, we can reduce the currently high rates of spoilage due to temperature, moisture, and really common contaminants like dust, flies, domestic animals. So promotion of low-cost technologies can help increase incomes, but also, very importantly, reduce the cost of nutrient-dense aquatic foods for consumers.
Thanks for that, Gina. Wow, you've actually touched the nerve, actually, from my perspective as a consumer, to sort of find out that the neglected area of research is around food safety. That's crazy. But anyway, so provided the food safety sort of measures and research sort of are kind of in place, what do we need to do to ensure fish and aquatic foods are actually part of a healthy and balanced diet to solve critical public health challenges at global but also national levels?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. So let me start with the newly released 2020 High Level of Panel Expert Report on Food Security and Nutrition, where in that report they advocate a shift toward nutrition-driven production policy. I think that this is critical, that we take a food systems approach that ensures and supports nutrition-driven policy, and that we earmark resources on the most pressing issues that are faced by producers, retailers, consumers, and other actors in food systems to ensure that fish and aquatic foods make it from safely from lake to plate. We can also specifically target food system policies and development programs, including country and donor strategies and investment plans, and social safety net programs like fresh food vouchers and school feeding programs to include fish and aquatic food sources. Thirdly, we can ensure that policies and programs prioritize the nutritional needs of the most vulnerable. We talked about the need, for example, for research on cognitive development for young children. So we need to also ensure that these programs and policies targeted toward the most vulnerable are designed with enough flexibility to actually be able to incorporate aquatic foods. And then lastly, consumer and public health concerns on food safety do need to be addressed. This can be done through increased consumer education and provision of accurate information, both at point of retail and also through national government systems, including, for example, food-based dietary guidelines. And then finally, ensure that there's the appropriate investment in this low-cost technology to ensure that fish and aquatic foods are ingredients in healthy and safe diets.
Thanks, Gina. Lots of great ideas and obviously quite a lot of scope for more research in this area. So I'm going to move next to Johan, who is the Director General of IFPRI, to explore actually another important question. I think it's safe to say, Johan, that the global agriculture research agenda, at least over the past 50 years, has traditionally focused on sort of land crops and livestock. As we've heard from Jim earlier, in recent years, we've seen this increasing effort to examine and materialize the potential of aquatic food systems to relieve pressure off land-based food production systems. IFPRI, like WorldFish, is part of CGIAR, the world's largest global agriculture innovation network, the catalyst, some say, to the green revolution. And currently, we know from our experience that the CGIAR network is undergoing reforms for greater organizational integration to sharpen its mission and also increase its impact on sustainable development outcomes. And it's trying to do that by focusing more and more in these integrated approaches to food systems research, as well as to sort of looking at the interconnections between human, animal, and environmental health. So from IFPRI's global policy perspective and also experience, what do we need to do to build this holistic agriculture research agenda that integrates food production systems on land and in water, and so that we are able to guide effectively some of those choices and policies that we need to make that, you know, Gina mentioned, for example?
Thank you very much, Tana. I mean, that's a that's a big question. Actually, it's a big number of questions even. So let me see if I can address at least part of them, and we may be able to come back in the Q&A on some. I think it's definitely true that historically, and also in many, not just globally in the CGIAR system, but I think also in many countries, fisheries and aquaculture have received less attention, less funding as well than crops and livestock. I think it's part is due to the fact that they were just smaller in terms of market size, smaller probably in terms of consumer baskets, particularly for the poor, and they were therefore also somewhat less on the political agenda, I think. But there's exceptions to that, okay? If you look, for example, fishing rights, these can be very big conflicts between countries, have received a lot of political attention. Think about what's happening with Brexit and the EU right now. Fishing rights are a really major political issue there. And also, I think in countries where fisheries and aquaculture were important, you find Minister of Fisheries, research institutions focused on it, etc. But I think a lot of things are changing right now, or have changed in the last 25 years. Aquaculture has grown tremendously globally. I think the total size, if you look at the metric tons, gone like ×5 or something, which is huge globally. Then that, of course, has impact on the economic impact it has. It has impact. It basically affects the poverty impact it could have in terms of, because it affects so many more people, etc. And a lot of poor people are involved in aquaculture. And nutrition has become a major effect. And I think both Gina and Jim already referred to the importance of healthy diets and the role that fishery products and aquaculture products can play in that. If you look, both the East Lancet report has come out with the importance of fishery products in a healthy diet, and then the recent SOFI report of FAO statement, the study on food insecurity, basically finds that a healthy diet is unaffordable for so many billion of people in the world, and so therefore also there it's going to be very important. I think also another thing which has changed over the past 20 years, I would say, is the focus moving away from production only to a food systems approach, okay? And I think that will also remove kind of the bias against the agriculture versus fishery production, and more basically starting from the consumption model. And of course, there's been significant economic growth in the world, also in transition countries and emerging economies, whatever, and that has increased the demand for fishery products quite significantly, I think. Coming back on that, you also see now there are direct links, I think, with fisheries and agriculture, and of course also the research related to that, with several SDGs, SDG 12, 13, 3, etc. And so I think also from that perspective, there is more demand for studying basically fishery and aquaculture products. At IFPRI, we just produced a book on Bangladesh with a very the entire analysis of the entire aquaculture sector there. It's called The Making of a Blue Revolution. And so the numbers there are just enormous, okay? We've seen that in a period of only 10 years between 2004 2014, the number of fish farmers have grown by 60%, the production by more than 100%, number of wholesalers, feed dealers, fish traders by more than 100%, per capita consumption has almost doubled over this period. And this has had tremendous impacts on the food security, nutrition, and also reduction of poverty in that country, okay? And that's just taking us the potential that aquaculture and fisheries have. If you then look forward in terms of the research, I think we have to look at the challenges, okay? And the challenges are in many ways. One is on the capacities of the agencies to support these developments. I think they need evidence-based analysis to set up the right policies. Focus on food safety, which Gina emphasized several times, is really important for fish products, aquaculture products. Building institutions for data collections, etc., is clearly needed because that is not well developed. And also, when we looked at it, the knowledge of the environmental and the ecological consequences were relatively limited, actually. So there's clearly a lot of room for doing better in combining economic analysis with environmental analysis, biological analysis. So really an interdisciplinary, holistic approach. We have already worked together within the CGIAR system together. For example, IFPRI and WorldFish have worked on a number of projects together, focused on evidence-based policy recommendations, but also development of sustainable food systems, etc. And I think for the future, we just have to do better. So we are not building back better, but we're building the future better, or hopefully we are in the One CGIAR. And I think issues like livelihoods, food security, nutrition, gender as well. I haven't mentioned gender yet, but according to FAO, about roughly 50% of people working in the value chain are actually women. Okay, so there's a big gender component. Regulatory issues and food systems approaches are tremendously important for that. Obviously, it's particularly when we look at related, not just the food safety regulation, but also the food safety regulation, but a whole bunch of other regulatory issues, particularly if you think about trade between countries, etc. I think I've used up my time by now, so I'm happy to answer more questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Johan. I think, well, actually, all three of you have sort of triggered quite a lot of questions from the audience. So I'm going to sort of go to the audience in a minute to just, you know, throw a few quiz questions and a poll. But like maybe if I could just sort of ask a few, you know, pick up a few questions from the question box. So maybe first one to you, Gina. What role do you see for aquatic foods in securing human health and malnutrition for children below the age of 5 years old? Ah, good. So excellent. The team actually has put some questions for the three of you already. So it gives Jim and Johan some time to think while Gina sort of helps us explore that question. Gina, can you unmute yourself? We can't hear you very well. Well, we can't hear you actually. Okay, I think we're gonna go back to.
Sorry, Tana. The organizers had muted me. So yeah, just unmute your panel speakers when they need to talk. Yeah, so thanks a lot for that question. Sorry, it took a little time to unmute. You know, it's a good question about children. I mean, often in nutrition, we focus on two specific age groups, children who are under age 2 and then children from 5 years and below. And so aquatic foods are really important for this age group because children have really high nutritional demands because of their growth and development needs. So they have higher needs for nutrient-dense foods than adults have to support their growth and development. So what this means is that if we continue kind of on our track of consuming too many calories that aren't nutrient dense enough, it leads to these problems that we see with stunting and wasting and underweight and micronutrient deficiencies, all of which hamper growth and development of kids these ages. And then, you know, once you have experienced one of these nutritional setbacks, it's very difficult for you to regain your nutrition and health. And a topic that has come up in other discussions that we've had with WorldFish is also cognitive development. So I mentioned that in my remarks, but cognitive development is difficult to study, but it's a really under-researched area, but one that WorldFish could really capitalize on because all the essential nutrients that are found in aquatic foods could be very, very important ingredients for not only how children have stature, linear growth, and weight gain, but also for how their brains are growing and how well they're doing with that. So I think they're really important specific roles of aquatic foods that do help children of these young ages along a healthy trajectory for growth and development.
Thanks, Gina. I'm going to go over to Jim to take the next question. So basically, the question is, much of the aquatic foods research focuses on production, increasingly on consumption, but what research is being done on distribution?
Okay, so that huge topic, and I'm conscious we don't have very much time. Let me just highlight a couple things there that I think are important. I mean, one issue of distribution, which I alluded to in my remarks, is is the question of whether fish are going where they need to go, right? And the trade-offs we're making between selling fish off for export markets and the nutritional needs of local communities. And so looking at that kind of distribution question, quite important. Second is that COVID is showing up some of the frailties of the current the seafood sector, and you see big disruptions in some supply chains because of COVID shutdowns. The collapse of passenger air travel, for example, has had huge consequences for some fisheries sectors, but you see a lot of local breakdowns as well. Finally, one of the things that to me is most exciting is the potential of emerging technology to give us much more visibility into value chains and distribution systems than we had before. And that allows us to create a different kind of accountability for how we are managing all food production, but including fisheries and aquaculture production, and also to harness the private sector to help us move in the direction that's called for by the Sustainable Development Goals, to a more sustainable more sustainable sector. So I think those are three dimensions of how we're beginning to get into some of the challenges of distribution and value chains, but there's a ton of work to be done there and a lot of potential, I think.
Yeah, and indeed, actually, we do have teams of researchers and partners as well that are kind of looking at examining some of the disruptions to distribution channels in many of the countries that WorldFish and partners work in. So Johan, can you tell us very quickly so a few key actions and barriers to making this transition to a global aquatic food systems approach?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a very broad question, so let me just identify a couple of things. I think infrastructure is obviously really important. Okay, infrastructure is important for a number of reasons, both for small scale aquatic production, also for larger scale production. For essentially, it's not only for getting the fish to, or the other products from the production side to the consumer, but it's also for, in terms of small scale production systems, of getting feed, for example, to the farmers, etc. Infrastructure can also do the information system. Okay, what's the type of products that people want, when does it have to be delivered, the conditions, etc. Institutions, in a very broad sense, things like regulations for food safety, labeling, things, or just basically credible labeling is really important. If you look, and so there's a lot of public sector, private sector activities. If you look at the growth of exports of aquatic products and fish, it's been really strong over the past 15 to 20 years, also particularly from emerging countries, actually. So there is a lot of growth of a global aquatic food system, if you want. But as Jim already said, I mean, COVID has identified several weaknesses of the system, and there's been quite a bit of disruptions of value chains. But also what we see is there's a lot of innovations going on right now, both by the public sector and by the private sector, to try to deal with the new situation. And hopefully that these innovations, which are now being introduced much faster than they were initially planned, will make the whole system much more resilient going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Johan, and I think that will provides actually a really good segue into the subject that we'll be exploring with panel 2. So I really thank you for your sharing with us these important insights. I'm going to turn now to our audience to actually hear some of their thoughts on the subject, and also do a little bit of a quiz to see how much attention they have been paying to some of those figures that you guys have been throwing around. So I'm gonna go with the help of the IT team. Let's see if we can put up a quiz question. All right, so how many people rely on aquatic foods for their livelihoods? One of our speakers, panelists and speakers, did mention this in their remarks. Select one of the following: 80 million, 800 million, 950 million, or 2 billion. And by these, I think aquatic foods that come from both aquaculture and small-scale fisheries. So I'm going to give you a few more seconds, and let's reveal those results. We have over 440 people joining us today. Just giving a few more seconds for people to respond. All right. Okay, it seems like we have a very wise crowd. Yes, option B is the correct one. So let's go to the next question. What is the annual fish consumption per capita globally? Is it 15.5, 18.5 kilograms, 20.5, or 22.5? I see, the team has been very cheeky in sort of adding those numbers with the 0.5s in the back. So, all right, so let's see whether the audience will get this right again. I'm rooting for everyone to get this right again. Okay, and so let's see if we can reveal those results. Yes, perfect. C is the correct answer. And then now I'm going to ask you just a quick question in terms of what do you think should be the research priorities of a global program on aquatic foods. So let's see what the audience tells us. So you've heard a lot from our experts today, but what in your view, what should be the key research priorities for this program on aquatic food systems? So is it climate adaptation and greenhouse gas reduction? Is it environmental health and biodiversity? Is it poverty reduction, food and nutrition security, or gender equality, youth and social inclusion issues? So I'm going to give you a few seconds to make your selection, and we'll see like which one topic here is most important to this particular audience today. All right, let's look at those results. Okay, well, as sort of expected, I mean, food and nutrition security, that's a big one. Obviously, like the fundamental challenge that we're all facing is really about how we feed the world, the 9 billion people by 2050, in light of all these different challenges that sort of relate to that. So, yeah, a clear indication that that's really, really important to us. And obviously, this is also quite, a common vision and mission in a sense that we, WorldFish also shares with many of the partners that we've gathered here. So thank you, audience, for engaging with us. Now I'm very excited to sort of move on to the next panel. So with our first group of panelists, we basically looked at exploring the question of these research priorities that we needed to sort of keep in mind for the global program on aquatic food systems, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. With the second group of panelists who've been waiting and sitting very patiently with us, we'll explore another dimension of what's required to put in motion the action part of this global movement on aquatic foods. So I'm going to ask the other panelists to sort of make themselves visible to us. So first, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you today to Manuel Barange, who's the Director of Fisheries and Aquaculture Policy and Resources at FAO. Welcome, Manuel. Thanks for joining us today. And next up, we have Belinda Richardson, who's an Agricultural Development Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome, Belinda. So first up, let's go to Manuel. So we heard from the first panel about the research work already underway to address critical gaps in scientific data and knowledge, and sometimes even misconceptions related to aquatic food production systems. But what are the policy and investment priorities that will help us realize this untapped potential of aquatic foods? And more importantly, what are some of the things that we need to address in terms of policy gaps and priorities that FAO member states need to increasingly adopt to make aquatic foods a critical solution to these challenges?
Okay, thank you, Tana. Sorry, we can't unmute ourselves, so we're waiting for your team to unmute us every time. First, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. It's nice to be here, and thank you, WorldFish, for organizing this event. I'd like to first of all also remind everyone that 2020 is actually the 25th anniversary of the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, which has been the main document guiding fisheries policy at regional and national level ever since. And emerging from the code, the FAO has released about 50 different technical and policy guidelines, including the voluntary guidance on small-scale fisheries, the voluntary guidelines on tenure, the catch documentation schemes, the Port States Measures Agreement, and so on. We have not got a shortfall of policy, actually. We have a shortfall of successfully implemented policies, and that's perhaps the first message. The second message that I want to give you is that, and this is very much linked to the COVID-19 pandemic, is that the Sustainable Development Goals attempt to balance the ecological, the economic, and the social sustainability legs of the stool. And the last two have been really very badly affected by the pandemic, the social and the economic legs of the stool. We often talk of the fact that 1/3 of all marine fisheries are unsustainably fished, which is very true. But this is only the one leg of the stool. The other two are very different. And the pandemic has badly affected supply chains. Demand dropped significantly. Trade was severely limited. Processing activity in boats, in harbors and factories was curtailed. What have we learned in terms of policy regulations and incentives from this? And there are two particular things that I'd like to mention. The first is that we need better mechanisms to protect supply chains and to innovate our fish-to-fork systems that allow, for example, for more automation and more digitization, and to facilitate trade as much as we can. And the second thing is we need to strengthen our social support systems, which have been so very badly demonstrated for their inefficiency, in fact, during the pandemic. They have not been very successful, especially in small-scale fisheries, where labor arrangements are often informal, from insurance, from deferred payments, from compensations. Most of the community was not able to address them, to take benefits from it, because they are not formally employed. Now, these support systems, I must also say that they need to incentivize the entry of the youth in the sector, a sector that is aging very rapidly. And we need to empower women more, which are often the hidden side of the sector. We need to remember that without social sustainability, the sustainability stool does not hold. And my third message is a call to attention. The FAO released just a few weeks ago the 2020 edition of the SOFIA report, the State of World Fisheries and Aquaculture. And in it, we reported that 2018 was a record year for the sector, a record year in terms of production, a record year in terms of consumption, a record year in terms of trade, and in terms of income from trade for the developing world. This demonstrate the input that the sector has in terms of fighting hunger and malnutrition. But FAO has also reported that the number of people suffering from hunger has been growing since 2015. And as a result of it, mostly because of climate crises and political instability, the world is fighting hunger and is failing to fight hunger. Fish is food and must be harvested for the long-term benefit of all. If fisheries and aquaculture were not as productive as they are today, hunger and poverty will be even worse than they are.
Right. It's crazy. I think listening and sort of listening to some of these sort of figures that you mentioned, Manuel. So what are some of the opportunities? I guess, if you could sort of really focus on telling us 2 or 3 specific challenges and opportunities that we really must sort of seize in the next few years.
Thank you, Tana. So yes, I will give you 3, and they'll be the same. The challenges and the opportunities are the same, as every entrepreneur knows. The first one is actually whether we have to address a narrative divide in the world regarding capture fisheries. A narrative divide that is like this. In the global north, people care about conservation and pays not enough attention to the fact that fishery sustainability has taken a very significant turn for the better in the global north, mostly because science-based fisheries management systems have been effectively implemented, as Sophia's report also demonstrated. And then we have the global south, which cares primarily about food and jobs, and perhaps not paying sufficient attention to the fact that the sustainability of many of their fisheries is deteriorating. And this is a terrible divide. And this is why in FAO we insist in saying that management is the best conservation. We need more science-based management systems in place. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is also about a narrative divide, but in this case in relation to aquaculture. In the global north, there is a cultural bias against aquaculture, where the not in my backyard narrative often dominates and at times criticizes the sector's ecological footprint, which it has, of course, but with completely different expectations from land-based food production footprints, which are way larger, as we mentioned already by the previous panel. We need to address this divide. In the global south, on the other hand, what we need are very strong global sustainable aquaculture guidelines and frameworks, more policy in that regard, so that growth is sustainable, diseases are controlled, value chains are developed, and markets and trades are accessible to all. This divide has to be addressed specifically and urgently. And the final message, perhaps the final challenge, is that I'm trying to convince FAO members now for some time that because of the issues that I have raised before, we need new sustainability programs where fishery sustainability is declining and where aquaculture is failing to thrive. Over the last couple of decades, there has been a clear net decline in the volume of ODA funding to fisheries and aquaculture all over the world. And the consequences of this defunding will be dire. To give you an example to finish off, is that by 2030, Africa will be the only continent with a decrease in net per capita consumption of fish, unless we change the current trends. And if fish is not there for them, broader nutrition targets and hopes will also have to be dashed.
Thank you, Manuel. Some of it is kind of a bit of a sobering sort of picture, but you obviously deal with policymakers and interact with them on a regular basis. And so, I want to ask a question that I'm kind of looking at, the chat box coming up from the audience, in terms of what can the research community do to actually influence some of these high-level decision-making processes?
So science and research are absolutely crucial in the fight for sustainability, because the only successful sustainability programs are based on science and are based on evidence. We need to protect the evidence base. And for that reason, we need to protect the science base. But the science also needs to consider the broader context in which fisheries and aquaculture take place. It is not just an issue of ecological sustainability. It is not just an issue of economic sustainability. It is not just an issue of social sustainability, but all three are connected. And very often science misses that point and often tries to put the one leg of the stool above the other. And clearly you can't do that. The three should be the same length. And I hope that science will, over time, move towards a more balanced approach so that ecological issues and social issues are considered as well as economic issues at the same time with the same efforts.
Thanks for that message, actually. Considering that most of our audience is sort of coming from the research community, I hope that that message, is sort of taken on board, particularly from someone who works for an organization that helps sort of bridge that divide, or that, place between science and policy. Thank you so much for sharing all of these insights. I will now turn to Belinda Richardson with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who represents an important actor globally in terms of those actors that play a critical role in addressing challenges of our times. So Belinda, from from poverty to health, to education, to youth and women's empowerment, the foundation has been a strong advocate for meaningful partnerships that bring together resources, expertise, and vision across the public and private sector aisles to identify issues, find answers, and drive positive change, especially for the world's most vulnerable populations in the global south. Recently, as we heard from many of our experts before, this global COVID-19 pandemic has exposed critical weaknesses in our food systems. And recent reports by the World Bank and Oxfam and other estimates indicate that people in developing countries particularly are likely to die from starvation caused by this economic fallout of the crisis of the pandemic, as opposed to the disease itself. And we are seeing many governments and many philanthropic actors spending breathtaking sums of money defending against the health and economic battering of the pandemic. But we're also seeing, as also Johan mentioned earlier, the private sector really stepping up and playing a significant role in the process. So how can we forge and leverage innovative public partnerships to help build forward better with fish and aquatic foods in this new context?
Thanks, Tana. And I hope everyone can hear me since you can't see me. So I think this is a really relevant question for me to field, and I'm thrilled to be participating in this panel discussion. If you work in this sector, you know that the Gates Foundation is a relatively new donor to the sector, and we began scoping fish and aquaculture in 2017 as a potential new area of investment, really because we did recognize the potential of the sector to impact on nutrition and livelihoods, as we've heard from the panelists. And we're recognizing the scale at which fish and aquatic foods, like other animal source foods, are interesting for income and nutrition, especially for some of the world's poorest. So as implied in the question, and really as the other panelists touched on, there's this added complexity and urgency from these challenges like COVID or climate change. But really with this challenge, there are opportunities to reimagine the way that we work to address these challenges. And I think as the global approach to development evolves into one that more closely incorporates the private sector, an important shift in thinking has really been to understand poor farmers and consumers not as beneficiaries or victims, but really as economic actors with choice and with purchasing power. We use the information and products available to make purchasing decisions, whether it's inputs for their farm or food for their plates. And the purpose of development then really as a means to expand their choice and increase their purchasing power. And this way of working really requires both the public and private sectors. So the private sector, which can be quicker to respond to market signals and identify disruptive technologies, these private sector partners are key for delivering and scaling products and services that do reach small-scale producers and poor consumers. And then the public sector is equally critical for providing some of that supporting regulatory environment that Manuel spoke to, and enables the private sector really to operate and provide funding, and also provide funding for public programs that also have the potential to persist and be sustainable. So there's a renewed focus on these public-private partnerships because you really do need both of these components working in cooperation. And so if we look at the total global spending on development, philanthropy is really a drop in the bucket to what government and private sector can deliver. And so the key word here, I really think, is leverage. So finally, getting to directly answering the question, how can we leverage public-private partnerships to build this better future forward with fish and aquatic foods, especially with this additional complexity from COVID-19? So how can donors, and I guess I just speak for the Gates Foundation, but how can we lay the foundation and the groundwork for these public-private partnerships that can really scale and sustain? And so we can draw some analogies from other sectors, and we have some specific examples within the Gates Foundation ranging from the livestock sector to human health that demonstrate how we can work in partnership with public and private sector to scale some of these innovative research solutions and transform food systems and spur growth. And this isn't always a smooth process, so it might be interesting to highlight here some general principles and best practices that we've started to compile from experience. And this is not an exhaustive list, but really just an effort to understand what have been some of the barriers to public and private public-private partnerships working together successfully. So just maybe 3 or 4 quick bullet points here for these general principles. So really looking where private sector can create shared value. So there's opportunities for private companies to achieve long-term sustainable business returns of quality products to small-scale farmers, and then to identify the roadblocks that really deter the private sector from entering those markets. Also understanding the markets and the business environment and how it affects the opportunities and challenges for the private sector to operate. And then just one less technical point is really overcoming some of the perceived conflict of interest by both the public and the private actors, since they're really working together towards some of these shared outcomes that were highlighted throughout this panel discussion. And so I think, we're just starting to be able to address some of these hurdles on the road to finding alignment. But just to wrap up, and reiterate a few of the points that were covered during this discussion, I think it's more important than ever to work together across public and private sectors, and really to ensure that good policy and investment decisions are guided and informed by robust science. And that's critical to building a global movement for research and action on food systems, including aquatic food systems, to mitigate the effects of this impending food and socioeconomic crisis as a result of COVID, and especially in low and middle income countries, and ensure that we don't go back on the progress that's already been made towards the Sustainable Development Agenda.
Thanks, Belinda. I think a really strong message there in terms, I think we haven't lived before in times where, science to guide policy and investment and just decisions, good decisions, period, is so important. So thanks for kind of sharing that message with us. Actually, I want to sort of just very quickly pick up a question from the audience that sort of perhaps relates to you. How can we sort of create opportunities through investments for young people to kind of get involved with, in aquatic food systems, and sort of in capitalizing opportunities through public-private sector engagement? So really, like, how do we energize and engage and kind of bring youth into the picture through this?
So this yeah, thanks, Tana. This is a great question, and I think a very interesting one, and pertinent. I'm not necessarily an expert on this, so I can just give a few general thoughts, but I think from the private sector lens, and depending on our experience or sort of what we've been exposed to, sometimes we think of private sector only as large multinational companies or small medium enterprises, but it's really the full spectrum of large and small companies at all nodes of the value chain. So input providers, agri-dealers, farmers themselves, which we always forget as private sector actors, offtake and marketing, and then all of the auxiliary jobs created through the food system. And so I think, for example, across Africa and Asia, we've seen stronger youth participation in some of these auxiliary opportunities, some app-based innovations, some of those jobs and innovations that really accelerate progress in context-specific and culturally relevant ways. We see the youth stepping up. Countries with more sophisticated aquatic production systems, for example, I know in the Norway salmon industry, there are targeted efforts to involve youth in the industry through training programs, and then really the young researchers from all regions coming through the pipeline. So it's not a given, and I think intentional effort to involve the youth is absolutely necessary, but some positive progress.
Thanks, Belinda. I hope that's a good sort of response to whoever asked the question in the audience. So next up, let me go to Rob Bertram, who is sitting patiently with us from USAID. Rob, USAID and WorldFish have a long history of working together on fish and aquatic foods, as we've seen them through, as critical solutions to hunger, malnutrition, and some of these other challenges. And what we've learned actually from our work together on many projects that actually have been part of the USAID's Feed the Future initiative is that fish and aquatic foods can also help leverage progress on a number of other sustainable development goals. So from your perspective, would you say that to actually invest in fish and aquatic food solutions is to actually invest in COVID-19 recovery, particularly for countries in the developing world?
Well, thank you, Tana, and greetings, everyone. And I see under my picture the name Shakuntala Tilstead, and I'll just say in this particular setting that it's an honor to be confused with Shakuntala. So I'm very honored. So absolutely, fish and aquatic foods are a prime example of one of the places where COVID-19 is affecting food and nutrition. And it's particularly acute here because it's a dual shock, right? We have reduced income, economic activities in cities and towns. Tourism, of course, is off the board. Travel, remittances are down. There's all kinds of things that are basically constraining effective demand because poor people especially don't have money to spend on higher quality foods. At the same time, the fish and aquatic food value chains are exactly those that are the most vulnerable because there's a lot of human activity along them. There's a lot of employment, which is great under normal circumstances. In these circumstances, that becomes a challenge. So it's a dual whammy in a sense, and so less affordable prices and less income, and that's not to mention the direct hit on producers and all the people along the market chains, transports, producers, retailers that are also taking a hit. So it's basically a perfect storm for nutrition. And it's the nutrition implications, we know this is real. If we think back to the work of Martin Blom in Bangladesh, where WorldFish and USAID have worked so profitably and so effectively together with the Bangladeshis, nutritious foods are, when people don't have money, they shift back into staples, the starchy staples. And Martin Blom did wonderful work showing that when rice prices were high, child malnutrition actually went up. So nutrition and prices were inversely related. High rice prices, bad nutrition. Well, this is just a squeeze from the other end where you're having higher prices for quality foods and people, again, have less income to spend. So the other thing worth mentioning about nutrition is that the health system is taking a huge hit here too. So that is normally providing a lot of key nutrition services. So in a sense, quality diets are more important than ever right now during the COVID crisis, in part because the health system is overtaxed. And, WorldFish's own data show us what's happening here. Let's see, so example in Bangladesh show that fishers and aquaculture producers and businesses face significant economic losses and setbacks, restricted movement of vehicles, closures and slowdowns. Blockages are preventing aquaculture farmers and businesses from selling fish or buying critical inputs. Some 80% of fish hatcheries are not operating due to labor shortages and personal security. So production is expected to be seriously impacted by this breakdown on the input side. And then on the fishery side, in Bangladesh alone, 400,000 fishers have faced fishing bans over the last couple months because of the COVID situation. And that directly affects the livelihoods and well-being of about 2.5 million people in the coastal areas. And shrimp processing industries have closed. And of course, one of the earlier panelists mentioned the transport issues and how much that has affected that. And 50,000 women workers are out of a job. So gender impacts in this situation are extremely important. These are just from Bangladesh, and which is one of our great success stories. The larger message is clear. Where the aquatic sector is important in national food and economic systems, we need to be investing in it as part of a stabilization process. So that can be things about green channels, trade and transport, things that can help markets work and keep producers producing and get people affordable, nutritious foods. The other thing I think we have to do is identify weaknesses as we respond to COVID, and that's going to help us, as has already been mentioned, build back better. We can use new tools to find solutions. We can use innovation, but we can also keep an eye on facilitating building back production and distribution in ways that that position us well for the future. So necessity can be the mother of invention and innovation, but we don't just want to let it be the mother of that. We want to aid and abet it and try to make that. And that's where the science community and the R&D partnerships with the public and private sector, with WorldFish and others. The other thing I would say is that once we're past COVID, the climate issue is going to come roaring back. And we know that fish foods and aquatic resources, aquatic foods are rate really well for many, many reasons in terms of sustainability, being climate friendly and climate smart. So we also need to take advantage of those. The other point I'd like to come back to, picking up on Gina's comments, is that these are the foods that are the bulwark to end micronutrient malnutrition, vitamin A, iron, B12 deficiency. All of these deficiencies are associated with diets high in starchy staples, and fish foods and aquatic foods are one of the most affordable ways to address those deficiencies. And this is also a way that, going back to Gareth's comments, that the fish sector can help make a quality, affordable diet available to low-income people everywhere. And that is an offset to the triple burden of nutrition. I mean, these are not the foods driving obesity, right? This is the fish and vegetables and horticulture and meat and dairy and eggs. These are the nutrition-friendly foods that are also pathways out of poverty for rural people, where poverty and extreme poverty and child stunting those areas are where those issues are most concentrated. So it's a great combination of coming together. Last point I'll make is just to say that we at USAID are working to engage our domestic research community in partnerships with WorldFish, with FAO, and with national programs in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nigeria, Kenya, Zambia, working on key issues that we think will have broad application, certainly in those places, but beyond them as well. So, and then just to close, the other angle on fish in USAID is from biodiversity. And indeed, what they focus on there in fisheries is sustainable productivity, to protect the resource, to add value to it in ways that also come together to deliver food security, nutrition for both coastal dwellers, but also people who purchase it in inland areas as smoked or dried fish. So we need to look at all these factors, along with gender, along with nutrition, and productivity, and conservation, to get to a really sustainable and exciting fish foods and aquatic foods future. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Actually, well, some of the messages that you panelists have sort of been talking about are triggering quite a lot of comments and questions on the part of the participants. So actually, here's an interesting one, perhaps maybe for you, Rob and Belinda. It's from a researcher from ICRISAT. Food systems transformation will require substantial policy investment and repurposing. So what's the thinking on the part of the donors and investors in terms of where we need to go to ensure that? So whoever wants to take it.
Belinda, would you like to go?
No, Rob, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I would say, and actually Jo Swinnen is the other person that's been on the program today who would have a lot to say about this, I'm sure. But absolutely, what good policy can do is combine those things I talked about and essentially incentivize both public, for example, in market infrastructure and such, roads and hatcheries, perhaps even in some places, but also private investment in the input services, in markets, in cold chains, all these things that are going to also help deliver the food safety issues that we talked about earlier, as well as provide added economic incentive for investors across the board. So I'm really glad the point was made, because it's got to be a framing for all we do.
Right. Thanks, Rob. So maybe actually we should bring Johan in and sort of hear what he has to say on this question. Johan?
So,
we can hear you, and you can switch the camera on. Yeah, perfect.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I think Rob and I have been on 3 panels or so together today, so I think he wants to see more of me. I don't know why, because I thought he would be tired of seeing me. I have very little to add. I think obviously, I mean, policy is so important I'm talking for my own shop in a way, but I think everybody realizes on these things that it's really important to get the public sector regulations right in this field, because they're very important for food safety. I come back to it, but several people mentioned it already. But in fisheries and aquaculture, it's extremely important because of the health issues, etc. But the infrastructure is really important, and infrastructure is partly done by the public sector, but a lot of infrastructure in the food system is done by the private sector. And giving the private sector the right incentives, the right framework for making investments, making sure that if they make the investments, they can get the rewards, etc., both for domestic value chains and for global value chains, is tremendously important, I think. And but to do the right policy advice, you need to know the technicalities as well. And so that brings us back to joint research. I mean, things we can do within the one CGIAR system with different institutions. Because if you have economists setting policies which do not understand all the technicalities or the environmental effects, they may not come up with right answers. So interdisciplinary research is the way to go, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Johan. Manuel, do you want to weigh in on this as well? Okay, so I'm going to try and bring you in with another question. So there's actually a really interesting question that's coming through the audience as well. What's the scope of aquatic plants as a means to address food security and entrepreneurial opportunities? I don't know, maybe Gina or Jim could help sort of answer this question.
Well, if they don't, I can.
Okay, great. Manuel,
yeah, so I mean, it's just perhaps to reflect on the fact that, yes, I mean, aquatic plant aquaculture also is at an all-time high record. It's over 30 million tons of aquatic plants that we culture, and I think that this has been growing very fast, and we expect it to continue. The issue of aquatic plants is it's how much you can develop the value chain to allow this production to grow and to make a real difference in terms of nutrition. The use of aquatic plants is quite limited in many parts of the world, and you need to develop that value chain. And that value chain includes the consumer, of course, to educate the consumer on what you can do with aquatic plants that you can do now with land-based plants, and it can be a replacement. So I think there's an element in there of value chain development that applies to virtually every new product that goes into the market, every new production system, every new aquaculture, whether it is for fish or a crustacean or a mollusk or a plant. Developing the value chain is an essential element of a sustainable business. We have to see aquaculture as a business. It's fundamentally a business to make money and to feed people as a result of it. And for that, you need to develop the value chain.
Anna, may I make a quick addition?
Absolutely. This is supposed to be a dialogue.
Okay. Just as an example of where research can make a difference, we are working through the Fish Innovation Lab in partnership with international partners to look at developing algae, which is an aquatic plant or aquatic organism, let's say, if we can dispute where it fits, as a substitute for fish meal in fish feed. You know, this is a major issue in terms of pressure on marine fisheries and the diversion of bycatch into fish meal. This is a way that we can use innovation and science to provide solutions that are economically viable and help boost productivity, but also reduce the environmental footprint and are conservation friendly.
Thank you. Actually, the point that you just made relates to another question from the audience. that says something along the lines of how can we divert the use of pelagic fish like anchovies from fish meal and oil as the main sort of fish feed ingredients to fish powder for direct human consumption?
Well, actually, we already do that to a large extent. First, perhaps following up what Rob was mentioning a moment ago, you know, fish meal production has been decreasing over time. You know, we produce much less fish meal now than we did in the 1990s, and yet aquaculture has grown several times since then. So, and how is that? It's because the aquaculture industry has developed very successfully alternatives to fish meal in the feed needs, so that there's a much more balanced sort of diet. But a lot of the pelagic fish has to be reduced, and the reason for it is mostly technological. It's in many places is a high volume fishery where fish deteriorates very rapidly before getting to the harbor, and where it needs to be processed in order to be used. But the FAO has several school feeding programs in Latin America and in Africa where we actually use grounded fish powder that is added to soups and is used to feed the school meals. And the children go to school and they have a soup, and then somebody comes with a jar and adds a couple of spoons of fish powder. And this is a fantastic way of balancing nutrition. So if we could do that more regularly, of course we would. But I think it shouldn't be one or the other. Fish meal for aquaculture development is not a bad thing in itself. What it is a bad thing is if it puts an enormous pressure on the resources. But if the resources are managed properly, then you can do both. You can use it for fish meal for aquaculture development, or you can use it for human consumption.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's sort of going back to the point that Jim sort of made earlier at the beginning of this session in terms of looking at that whole picture and sort of balancing and sort of examining the trade-offs and the options. So I'm going to follow up with another question from the audience. I'm trying to accommodate as many as I can before we go into the next session. This one is from Omitoyen, who's from the University of Ibadan. He says, breaking into new markets is key to aquaculture production in Africa. How can farmers, fish farmers, be assisted to meet EU and other country specifications and standards so that their fish products can be accepted? So anyone in the panel that can help us with this question?
So I can come in quickly, I think, just to double down on the message of both public and private sector being critical to facilitating this sort of market entry for small scale producers especially. And so I think as we look at the role of research and infrastructure and sort of all these critical components that the panel has put forward, I think it's really that cooperation piece of having that enabling environment to really facilitate those private sector actors with an intention of reaching, you know, the inclusion piece of sort of reaching small scale farmers and really bringing the market to those farmers and bringing those farmers to the market. Yeah, so just I think the cooperation between the sectors being a really vital component.
Thanks, Belinda. Did I hear maybe someone?
Oh, I was going to say, I might add to that although the idea is an important one, the actual potential for regional markets and local markets within Africa, for example, is enormous. You know, we see a lot of urban demand for high quality food. So if some export opportunities helps drive quality and food safety, it's been mentioned several times, maybe that can spill back into the domestic market value chains and market systems as well. But we find that in many commodities, the greatest economic opportunity isn't all that far from home. So it's both are important.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Rob. And I have a really quick one, and I think this is a cheeky audience participant trying to test the panelists because we tested them earlier. So thanks so much for this discussion. I would like to ask whether our panelists would mind to articulate one current practice in the fish value chain that they view important to address that we need to sort of curb immediately, and this will help improve contribution of fish and aquatic foods to food security. So that's the thing. So if there's one, one bad practice, current practice out there that you think, if we sorted this out, maybe. I told you it's a tricky one.
Well, I'll speak up.
How about
Manuel, you know more about this than I. You go, please.
Go for it, Manuel.
Just very quickly, I think the overuse of antimicrobial drugs. Antimicrobial resistance is a big issue. I think needs to be addressed, not just in aquaculture, also in land-based animal production. Antibiotics are absolutely necessary and need to be used properly, but overuse of antimicrobial drugs can have very negative consequences and it needs to be stopped.
And we find surprisingly that sometimes the greatest overuse of these is in developing country settings. It's surprising that this is often concentrated in countries where we might not necessarily expect it. The only thing I'd add is that there are also instances where preservatives are used that are not safe to reduce decay or appearance of decay, but that can also be a negative nutritional and food safety impact.
So I can think of a bad practice.
All right.
And it's related to the consumer side. And and maybe also private sector and also public sector, really saying that we need more nutrient dense foods. And so we talk about milk, we talk about eggs, we talk about fruits and vegetables, which are all very important, but often we do ignore fish and aquatic foods. So this is a bad practice that we really need to improve upon. For example, we should be highlighting the role of fish in our food-based dietary guidelines, which is really a platform for the public understanding how to eat better. We should be highlighting the really important and essential role of essential fatty acids and other components of fish that are critical. We didn't bring in the fact, I've been scrolling through some of the comments, and we didn't talk that much about diet-related NCDs, but there's plenty of research also that shows that the essential fatty acids in fish and the fat composition of fish is a very healthy type of fat. And so it's something that consumers can be educated that fish is a really good source of nutrient dense foods, and it helps to make us feel more full. And then we wouldn't be consuming as many calories from other foods that are leading to our obesity and diet related health problems. So I think that a bad practice is that we really need to promote fish as a really essential part of a healthy diet and put it in more of our policies and programs.
Thanks, Gina.
Jim? If I can shift to the wild capture side, clearly with the effort, I think it was Manuel who mentioned that we've actually managed to shift to quite strong management in many parts of the world, especially in developed country fisheries. So we know it can be done, and we now have increasingly the technological tools to bring new visibility into how fisheries are managed and to create new kinds of accountability for better management. And cracking that problem is an opportunity that sits there, and it's clearly a priority for making sure we're using those resources sustainably.
Thanks, Jim. I think we have time for one more question from the audience that goes, is there a concrete global plan, again, to all the panelists, to address the issue of marine pollution to ensure sustainability of resources and biodiversity? Maybe Jim can help us out, or Manuel.
Is there a concrete global plan? So marine pollution has many dimensions, right? I mean, the one that gets the most attention at the moment is plastics. And there are several initiatives of various kinds, public and private, to try to tackle the challenge of plastics. Which is both the near-term challenge of trying to stem the flow of plastics into the ocean and the longer-term challenge of shifting away from our reliance on single-use plastics. There's not one global initiative there, but there's definitely there are definitely several. I think it's important that we don't let plastics overshadow the other acute marine pollution problems that affect food security and other concerns, especially coastal pollution of various kinds, the runoff of nutrients and pesticides, for example, and those need to be tackled. I don't know of a global initiative that is comprehensive in tackling those problems, but they clearly those are clearly need to be front and center, and there are several efforts to go after them in specific context.
Thank you,
I'm
Jim.
sure others could add to that.
Yes, please, Manuel.
Well, I think that Jim has addressed it really well, so I'm not going to add so much to it, but rather talking about pollution. You know, the biggest pollution that we have is climate change, which is a pollution of CO2 in the atmosphere. And if I can connect to the previous question on this, I think that what is going to be very important from a climate change perspective, and this is directed to the consumer, is that we need to get ready to eat what is available, not what we would like to be available. So climate change is going to change the distribution and the availability of different fish in different places, and we need to convince the consumer. And when they go to a fishmonger and the fishmonger says, today I have this, you buy that. You don't just say, well, where's my cod, where's my tuna? You buy what is available. That's the best way of ensuring sustainability from a consumer perspective, and that addresses the pollution problem of climate change too.
Thanks, Manuel. I think that's a really, really interesting point and a critical message as well, because I think we also spend time, you know, with researchers and policymakers, but, you know, oftentimes I think we kind of miss, you know, the perspective and the changes that we need to sort of address also from the community, the consumer perspective. So thank you so much for your views and for sharing all of these insights and for helping us sort of think through and consider the potential of aquatic foods as a solution to so many of these challenges that you've sort of brought up, particularly in the context of COVID-19. I'm going now to turn the tables on our audience and hear some of their thoughts on the subject. And we are going to run a little poll to see what they think the key policy and investment priorities should be in terms of building forward better with aquatic foods. So we've just kind of compiled a few options there based on some of the things that we've heard from our panelists. So one of them could be around perhaps, you know, option A, providing a sustainable supply of diverse aquatic foods. Option B, around reducing food loss and waste in the aquatic food systems, building up the supply chains of aquatic foods, ensuring healthier and sustainable diets through aquatic foods, and also perhaps prioritizing the health and nutrition needs of the most marginalized communities. So I'm going to give our audience a few seconds to ponder those options and let us know what's the priority that they think is most important. And by the way, what we're going to do is that we're collecting all of the questions that are coming through the audience and also the polls, and we will be sharing them with our research team and the partners that, you know, work with us as they currently are working on developing the granular details of this global program on aquatic foods that we're talking about today. So this is also like we're using this dialogue as a means to also collect some views and reflect some of these different perspectives in the work that we do to make sure that we're building a research agenda that is responsive. Okay, so let's have a look at those poll results. Okay, wow, so clearly all of those choices seem to be important. The most important one, obviously, providing a sustainable supply of diverse aquatic foods, sort of the top choice, followed by, you know, building up the food supply chains. Thank you, audience. We're going to move on to the next question. So since the subject of this first dialogue is really related to COVID-19, we wanted to also hear your views in terms of what's the factor that's most critical or important to ensuring a COVID-19 recovery with aquatic foods. So we've heard, for example, from Belinda, the role and the importance of building good, strong, healthy public-private partnerships. We've heard some of our panelists talking about a food systems approach. Manuel brought up the issue of leveraging digital technologies better. Gender equality was another topic that came up on Rob's messages, as well as, you know, this divide, I guess, between the global South and global North in terms of the narrative, and so how we make sure that we include both of those perspectives. So a few seconds to ponder those choices and see whether, you know, some of those audience thoughts are kind of aligned with what the experts are saying. Okay, so let's have a look at those results. All right, food systems approaches. So it's the top choice, followed very closely by the public-private partnerships. So that's another important topic. Maybe I could go very quickly to the panel for some reactions to this, what the audience is telling us.
I'm surprised that gender equality is so low, because I think that it's not been properly recognized that there are very significant gender issues in the fisheries and aquaculture sector, where women are particularly involved in the processing side of the sector, and they are being worsely affected by the pandemic, much worse than men. Very often also they have more informal arrangements. And I think that addressing gender equality is a crucial element of a recovery to COVID-19.
I really agree with you there, Manuel. I'm actually surprised too, and maybe, you know, part of the issue is that we do need to sort of communicate more about this particular subject and kind of raise awareness about the challenges, but also the involvement of women at every sort of part of the sector. Sure.
Can I add to that? I mean, I think I agree with that. I think the challenge in this question is that the right answer is all of the above.
Yes.
Right? That is the only way we're going to change the food system is through public-private partnerships that take advantage of the new possibilities of digital technology and are serious about gender equality and about perspectives from both the South and the North, right? I mean, I think that's the heart of it. And so in a way, I think the distribution is probably a little bit arbitrary yes. Because we know that we have to do those things in that way. And if I can just highlight one piece of that from our earlier discussion, we talked a lot about policy change. But a big part of driving policy change is to find ways to bring the private sector together around pioneering innovations that can make a difference and actually beginning to shift incentives and possibilities in the marketplace to enable that change. So there's a dynamic there that we need to all be fostering, but it covers all 5 of these points, I think.
Tana, can I add to what Jim just said?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, Rob.
Want to pile on and say that this is where there's such an important role for science to develop the evidence that drives innovation and partnerships, but also informs policy. One other thing I'd like to flag here is interesting to me, it's not surprising to see food systems approaches as the largest. What I would say is that raises one issue for me, and that is, let's find ways to make sure we keep the needs of the very poor and the undernourished at the top of the food systems agenda. Too often, it's driven by concerns around climate, around non-communicable diseases. That's fine. Those are really worthy goals. But let's be sure not to lose sight of those for whom a quality diet is still out of reach. Remember the work from Tufts University, Will Masters and others, that shows that a couple billion people cannot afford the Lancet diet, right? So there's still a lot of work ahead of us on undernutrition, and that's why fish foods and aquatic foods are so exciting, because they contribute to all of these goals at once.
Absolutely, I totally hear you on that, Rob. And if anything, I think in the current sort of circumstances of the COVID pandemic, I think that it is the most marginalized people that are being affected the worst in terms of their food, nutrition, you know, ability to sort of purchase food and all that stuff. So I hear you. That's a really, really important message. So I really appreciate. I know we can carry on talking about this subject endlessly, and that's why this is only the first in a series of virtual dialogues on aquatic foods. But I really value your participation and your contributions and sort of really being a good sport, engaging with our audience, who've also been a very good sport today. And I think to sort of help us sort of summarize a little bit the key takeaway messages from this discussion, I would like to invite Shakuntala Thilsted, who's a member of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, and also the nutrition and value chain lead at WorldFish. Shakuntala, over to you.
Okay, hi. Oh, thank you for unmuting me. Thank you, Tanya. I'd like to thank all our panelists and the many participants from around the world who joined us today. From a research leader's perspective, I know that the topic of aquatic foods is clearly interesting. However, today's discussions with our panelists, as well as the audience participation, show that this topic raises great interest with so many diverse actors who see the potential of aquatic foods in driving positive change for COVID-19 recovery, as well as achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. A key takeaway from the discussions we have had is that aquatic foods represent a solution that clearly deserves more attention in research, in policy, and in terms of future investments. We heard today from our panelists about the unique role and the unlocked potential of aquatic foods, alongside land-based crops and livestock, for addressing the critical global challenges, nutrition and public health, climate change, gender equality, social inclusion, and sustainable growth within planetary boundaries. Our first panel explored key research priorities to overcome misconceptions and fill critical gaps in our understanding of aquatic foods' ability to nourish people and the planet. They highlighted the crucial importance of building a more holistic agricultural research agenda that pays greater attention to linkages between land and water food production systems. We heard that there is an urgent need to bring greater understanding to the multiple benefits of aquatic foods into the hands of global policymakers. Strong partnerships are key to explore and materialize the potential of aquatic food systems, to relieve pressure on land-based food systems, and at the same time enable healthier and sustainable diets. People's ability to access diverse, nutritious, and safe foods is at risk, which in turn places their health and resilience under threat. We must explore the diversity of aquatic foods as a key solution. There are thousands of foods within aquatic food systems, and more research is needed to understand their nutritional value and the effects on cognitive development and good health. We need to understand consumer demands and promote aquatic foods as critical to keeping populations healthy and boosting immune systems, especially now in midst of the COVID crisis. We need to explore the seasonality of diverse aquatic foods to provide year-round availability and affordability of nutritious diets. Our panelists signaled research priorities must take a holistic food systems approach to help take the pressure off agricultural systems that focus on land-based crops and livestock. This must include the sustainable production of diverse aquatic foods from fisheries and aquaculture, so that we can minimize the impact on the environment and increase our resilience and adaptation to climate risk. Also, we must develop integrated research approaches to food, land, and water systems, as well as human, animal, and environmental health. One Health. We must find ways for these research priorities to influence policies and investments of governments and the efforts of donor agencies. Our second panel explored the policy, investments, and partnerships needed to put in motion a global movement for research and action on aquatic foods. We heard about the need for a well-coordinated approach amongst different sectors, different actors, to guide investment decisions for concrete interventions moving forward. Panel members pointed to the importance of science in informing critical policy and investment decisions to build forward better with aquatic foods now and in the future. In this regard, we need to examine and understand better the resilience of aquatic food supplies and value chains to address the current food and socioeconomic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as to be better prepared for future shocks. A global aquatic food research program must recognize the different needs, benefits, and trade-offs it offers for low, middle, and high-income countries. It must also work to provide greater equity and also balance between alternative narratives. Our discussion today revealed that there has not been a better time to reimagine new ways of working together, to build meaningful partnerships that bring together resources, expertise, and vision across the public and private sectors to address the global challenges of our time and to prioritize the needs and aspirations of the world's most vulnerable and poor. Aquatic foods research needs to be scaled through innovative partnerships between the public and private sectors, especially now in the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and to mitigate the dire impacts on people, our planet, and food systems. WorldFish and its vibrant network of partners are currently developing a global research program on aquatic food systems. To build forward better with aquatic foods, we need to mobilize a global movement that brings together the research community, governments, donors, the private sector, and consumers to co-create and implement evidence-based solutions of shared value, and in which aquatic food play an integral part in the global call to action for sustainable food systems transformation for healthy people and planet. Please do get in touch with us and our researchers at WorldFish to discuss ways in which we can partner and together build global momentum for a vibrant aquatic foods program. Thank you all, and over to you, Tanya.
Thank you so much, Shakuntala, for such a great sort of summary of the takeaways. I want to change my name to Shakuntala like Rob now. But I'm feeling I'm feeling very inspired, and I really sort of look forward to us continuing this conversation. But for today, that's all that we have time. Let me close this session by thanking our panel members for this fruitful and timely discussion, as well as all of the people that chosen to participate virtually in this event today. We hope you have been inspired and taken something useful from this discussion to apply to your everyday work, research, or individual and collective action for shaping positive change in the world through fish and aquatic foods. Coming up in September, please stay tuned for our next 2 virtual dialogues on aquatic foods, which will focus on the specific challenges and opportunities in the regions of Africa and Asia Pacific. Wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are. Please stay safe and healthy. And this session is adjourned. Thank you very much.